Good morning, everyone. Once again, big thank you for Akiho, who arranged all this important, great opportunity. The question I'm asking to myself these days is the Antarctic Treaty a shining example for the rest of the globe? Or is the Antarctic Treaty just a mirror of all the problems around the globe? Are we a good model like the Antarctic Treaty was to the Outer Space Treaty before? Or even like if we cannot afford to become a model, then are we a good integrator of all the good practices around the world and having them work in the Antarctic? Or are we just copying and pasting all of the problems around the globe in the Antarctic? And we have seen a bottleneck rather than breakthrough. But then what is science doing for all these things? So this session will be a great opportunity to discuss on this important topic. We have a wonderful array of panelists this morning. The original title was Science, Logistics, Education, and Outreach, and Science Policy Interface. Is it effective? Maybe we can start with Tracey from Australian Antarctic Division, who has been a long-standing member of CEP and all this important discussion. Phil, can you start by explaining how the science works, gets supplied and gets solicited in the Antarctic Treaty System, please?
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much to Professor Shibata, Kobe PCRC and the Core program for this event and for the opportunity to participate. Just for those who aren't aware, I work for our Australia's Environment Department in our specialised Australian Antarctic Division, which runs our Antarctic program and works with other parts of government on our engagement in the Antarctic Treaty System. I'm an Australian delegate to about 19 Antarctic Treaty meetings and one Antarctic Treaty meeting of experts, and I've been very lucky to spend quite a bit of time in different parts of Antarctica, mostly in East Antarctica. So I think just in a broad sense, I think the key message for me, for the whole period we're here, is that the critical features of the Antarctic Treaty System are baked in, with apologies to the interpreters, they're baked in or they're hardwired. So judging the system and its progress on outcomes, we have to keep in mind that if we're not stepping backwards on some of those very fundamental tenets of the system, then that's a measure of success. From our perspective, we don't need to see lots of resolutions or decisions adopted to represent progress. We need to see the system and its incredibly important and significant features maintained. So I think that's just a note based on some of the discussions today and yesterday about the importance of the core parts of the system and protecting and defending those in a contested world. When we come to science and policy, that's quite a good example of that. And I'll talk a little bit more about the pathway of advice from the scientific and from the operational community into the governance and decision making of the ATCM. But for a lot of key topics and issues, we don't need to have resolutions or measures or decisions as sort of flashy outcomes of the meeting, but the meeting is still being successful in doing some other things, which I'll touch on. So there's two sort of aspects of what the treaty meeting, including the Hiroshima meeting, can achieve for science and the fundamental collaboration that occurs under the Antarctic Treaty System. I think it's important to recall that we're managing an entire continent through this Antarctic Treaty System. Through an international discussion and governance, we're trying to serve many of the functions that normally operate in a national context, and that's not straightforward or easy. What we're dealing with is a genuinely unique legal, environmental and practical operating context. So when we see things like a very long report, some of the reasons for that are based on that unique characteristic and in some cases the unique role of the treaty system, the treaty meeting, in doing things like reporting on science activities, reporting on how collaboration is working, and so on. So, I guess it's fair to say that at times the ATCM struggles to understand, or the parties and the meeting struggle to understand what role the forum plays when it comes to science in the broad. A lot of the collaborations that occur in Antarctic science don't require the ATCM to direct or take decisions. And so we see the ATCM having a focus on the biggest of the multinational or international projects, such as International Polar Year, the InSync project, the RINGS project, and others. A lot of the scientific collaboration that is fundamental to activities in Antarctica occurs through bilateral or group discussions among interested parties, and the ATCM need not play a specific role in making those things happen. But it's the forum where people can get together, sometimes in the margins, and discuss how they're going to collaborate. So there's a bit of a tension, I guess, between the role of the ATCM as a place where Antarctic, the highest representatives in governments for Antarctic issues can come together and have those discussions. And that's not necessarily something that you'll see come through in the meeting reports. So we, Australia, and I know others, transact a lot of business during the ATCM that advances those big picture collaborative efforts. And then, in terms of how the ATCM receives and gets scientific information, we need to obviously respect and acknowledge the very important role of the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research as a formally acknowledged advisor, a scientific information provider to the ATCM. Similarly, COMNAP, the Council of Managers of National Antarctic Programs, has the status in the ATCM to provide advice on operational issues, including cooperation and collaboration. So the functionality of those processes, I think, is healthy. We see SCAR being able to provide sound scientific advice on a range of issues to the CEP and to the ATCM, which informs the decision making and policy making. Now, we might not always like what the outcome is when we get to that point, which is more of a policy and political discussion, but the fundamentals of that process work well. That's not to say, of course, that the ATCM can't receive scientific information directly from parties, and we do see plenty of that occurring through the meeting. And again, that's another reason why you see a relatively long meeting report. And just on that note too, I think it's incumbent on us to understand and be able to reflect the enormous investment, resources and effort that parties put into their Antarctic programs. And for many parties, the ATCM represents the best way at an appropriately high level to inform and provide information about those activities. And while it contributes to a longer discussion and a larger burden for us all, it is really important that all of the parties have the opportunity to share information through a mechanism like the ATCM. So I think that's probably sufficient from me. I'd just sort of like to reinforce that I think scientific collaboration and program-to-program cooperation is a norm in our system, and it's not an exceptional thing. It's one of those things that goes on very happily with really productive outcomes, and may not be a high-profile outcome, but a very fundamental and critically important part of what we do. Thanks.
Thank you, Phil. Phil just explained that Antarctic Treaty is a platform where scientific information can come together. It could be very huge investment and multinational, often interactive. Could be a source such as official organizations, SCAR, COMNET, but individual national programs can provide information for decision making. But in the real world, especially today, these days, how well this information is used and producing outcomes, that's a question. So what kind of perspective can you offer, Claire? Especially not the good part, but where the problem lies.
Well, thank you, and thank you to Akiho for organizing this, and thank you for having me on this panel today. I guess in terms of the science policy interface, where I would start is that from my perspective, and I think my organization's perspective as well, I'm with the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition. So we're the main environmental NGO observer in the treaty system. The environmental protocol includes a fairly robust set of values and in terms of environmental protection, and also tools, I think, that basically allow the parties to link scientific information to environmental protection outcomes. So the foundation is very solid, but that requires implementation. And unfortunately, in recent years, I feel that we are seeing a disconnect between the amount of scientific information we have available to make policy decisions and the ability to achieve consensus on those decisions. And I think, as Phil said, there are a large number of countries putting a huge amount of effort into taking that scientific information and trying to turn it into actionable policies. But because of the consensus-based system we have, those policy outcomes are not occurring, with the emperor penguin specially protected species designation being a particularly high-profile one. And I think where transparency often comes into this is that if you don't attend the meeting and you don't see the discussion, you might see in the report that the parties disagreed about the science. One party said that the plan of action was not fully developed. One party says that the science isn't, settled and isn't good enough. And that really collapses the debate, I think, sometimes, because it's very easy to say the science isn't good enough. And if you're just reading the report, you might not go to those papers and read actually what the scientific basis is. So you might think, oh, well, these parties presented a plan that wasn't ready. And that in my opinion, that would not be the case. We have a very small minority saying that it's not ready. A good example might be how, at least in my country, in the US, when they discuss climate change, they might have might have one scientist who says the evidence for climate change is very good, and then they have as a counterpoint one saying the evidence that climate change is occurring is not very good. And of course, most of the scientists agree with the first one and not the second one, but those perspectives are presented equally and given equal time to make their case. So I think we're seeing that in the Antarctic Treaty System, where we have a very large body of evidence that could be used to take decisions that would protect the Antarctic environment, but we don't have political agreement on how to implement the protocol. And that is, to my way of thinking, a growing problem. I'll give one example. In the protocol, there's a section on protected areas that says you can designate protected areas on the basis of creating an inviolate area for future study. And the idea behind that is that you would want to protect some areas where no one goes, not even researchers, for a certain amount of time, so that one day future researchers will be able to go to them and see what happened in an area where nobody has visited at all, which could provide some very interesting data. But in recent years, when some parties have proposed protected areas with these inviolate areas, other parties have said you should not have an area where scientists can never go. So that's, to me, is a pretty significant development on the policy side of things, because you are having countries that signed the protocol saying that we want to create inviolate areas, saying that now you can't do that, and blocking consensus to do that. So that, to me, is a huge issue. So I think the problem is not that, you might see sometimes people saying we don't have enough science. I don't think on just about any issue that has been discussed recently at the ATCM that there is not enough science. I think that the issue we have is that there is not a common agreement on what the values of the protocol are and what you're trying to achieve as you implement the protocol. And I think that is obviously a big problem for environmental protection. But I would say to the scientists, there's often discussion that I hear, how do we communicate better to policymakers? Scientists are communicating very well to policymakers. The policymakers need to work amongst themselves to figure out what it is they're trying to do with the ATCM and with Antarctic governance. And I think some of that is just about building more trust on the policy side of things. And I think that is something that is very difficult. It requires a lot of political will. It requires diplomatic investment. And I think it will just take time. So again, I would say the Antarctic Treaty System has an extremely solid foundation for linking science to policy outcomes, but we currently don't have the political will and the common understanding of values that we're working towards to be able to use it effectively.
Okay, now, when we need a breakthrough, there is often bottleneck, and there is disagreement what constitutes the best available science for some particular cases. Because of this disagreement, no decision is being taken, no decisions are taken, and we are losing time. So perhaps the quality of science itself may not be the major problem, but a will to use science and to produce something. So the lack of will might be a greater problem. That's what Claire is saying, I guess. And then we then hear from Narelle, who's from WMO and who also sits on IPY committee as well, upcoming major international campaign. I wonder what kind of view you can offer.
Hi everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's been really interesting so far, and all the different views. I think I would start by saying, just sort of reiterating what Phil was saying at the beginning about, the Antarctic governments. It must absolutely remain grounded in the best available science, and what happens after that, in terms of the policy, is almost a separate point. And I guess this is what you were saying as a shining example of the Antarctic Treaty System. It really has got the setup for this. The CEP plays this important role in translating the scientific understanding and trusted technical advice through SCAR and through all the other observers and experts. And this is actually exceptional. I am a bit worried about continued investment in science and in observations and data, partly because of the current geopolitical situation, moving more towards security investment, and a push also towards ramping up through Antarctic InSync and other big projects towards the International Polar Year. There's been a lot of discussion of whether the next International Polar Year will be different to the last one in terms of the ability to be able to invest in those projects right across the globe. And this, I think, is of concern because it is a huge opportunity to bring together collective international science to answer a lot of the questions that are rapidly becoming quite urgent. And I think we were talking yesterday about communication, and I think I would agree that science does quite a good job of this. I think perhaps communicating what comes out of the treaty process, we could do more on that. I mean, the Secretariat is obviously very limited, so if you're going to ask for that, you need to invest in that. But I think people are really interested in what's going on. Antarctica holds a lot. If you went to the education and outreach workshop on the first day, you will know that there's a lot going on. And I think there's potentially, a way of bringing this even further to the global community and strengthening the science input. Then I would say also that apart from the science, you get the observations and the data that sort of come out of it, through it, and feed into it. And I would say that right now it's still a little bit fragmented, and it depends on what you mean by data. There's a lot of different types of data. I'm coming from the World Meteorological Organization, so I'm thinking generally about more meteorological types of data. That does include cryosphere data, but there's also, many different types of data in terms of what we're talking about, the penguins and many things around oceans and fisheries, etc. And so I was really pleased to see that this was discussed quite a lot in the last in the treaty meeting. But how we deal with these incredible amounts of data going forward is going to be a key question. It's almost too much data in some cases, even though we know that there's sparse observations on most of the continent for a lot of the things that we want to do. And if we are talking about extreme events, tipping points, if we're talking about predictive models, if we want to know what's going to happen with our operations in the next season or with wildlife, we need to have those observations that are going to be able to get us those near-term predictions. And some of the work that we're doing through the World Weather Research Program, PCAPS, and through some of the other research through SCAR, is looking very hard at how to do this well. And right now, the predictive capacity is just not good. It's not good enough, and we can do better. I think there's also some concerns around how we go forward, maybe learning from other other fora, like in the World Meteorological Organization, we also have the problem of a lot of members who don't want to be required to provide a huge amount of observations because it's costly, and they may not have the capacity. We have something called the Global Basic Observing Network, GBON, which is a smaller number of essential variables that they are now required to measure and share. And I think this might be a path for some of your environmental monitoring, perhaps. And looking at things like this, it's going to become even more important as we go forward, because not only do we have a rapid changing environment, we also have a rapid changing technological advancements that are perhaps going at a pace which I know in the World Meteorological Organization we are struggling to keep pace in terms of weather prediction. Right now is largely being, a lot of AI is being used. It's incredibly good. But it comes with a bit of a black box mentality. So you need to know what you're feeding in order to know what's coming out is robust and useful. And so this is something as well that we can make use of. I heard a lot of discussions at the Antarctic Treaty meeting around this, how we use it for the power of good, I guess, and making sure that we really keep track of this. So I think a lot of these issues will come up around the International Polar Year. There will be, there is already a working group on data, which is strongly aligned with SCAR. There will also be a lot of questions around how these projects feed into the projects that come for the International Polar Year, feed into the Antarctic Treaty System, but also how is the Antarctic Treaty System going to get the most benefit out of the investments of countries into these projects? I think there can be a bit of a give and take there. Like I feel like at the moment there is only limited requests from the Antarctic Treaty to science. There is around particular issues, but broadly I think there could be potentially more, since we have such a huge investment, and that could be of interest to nations. And when they're going to invest, what do they want to invest in and why? And I think that could be something that doesn't come just through WMO, doesn't come just through SCAR, it could also come through the treaty members. So I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay. Narelle's statement on the significance of sustained observation and continued scientific investment is very due. And also she touched upon the new emerging technologies to make better use of this a huge amount of data, and the importance of upcoming large-scale international campaigns, and how best to use this kind of initiatives. And maybe I can ask Ebru to speak about her. Turkey has been an emerging, sincere contributor to Antarctic science, so she might have something to add on to that.
Thank you very much for inviting me in. Today I want to shed some light on a very known but confused words such as science diplomacy, because in order to label any kind of international scientific activity as science diplomacy, there are three preconditions. First of all, political will, and then diplomatic involvement, and supports from the governments. Otherwise, we will just merely have international scientific collaboration. So in order to strengthen our science diplomacy, we need to consider those preconditions well. So each country, each culture has its own unique ways of scientific competences and applications. I know that because since 2016, I live with the Arctic communities during polar night period. Each time I choose a different country. I've been Greenland twice, and Siberia, and Finland, Sami people, and Norway, and Russia. So I travel those regions, and I live with people, and I observe. And I collect data, and I use my data for my outreach activities. I translate their data into usable, practical scientific solutions for our community as well. And it attracts real attention in Turkish community. Since the ATS provides the common ground for governors, it's a good example of science diplomacy, but we need to adapt a more inclusive and adaptive governance. By adaptive, I mean which is a flexible, learning-based approach to decision-making that allows institutions to adjust their responses according to rules and responses according to new information, environmental shifts, and crisis. And here comes the greatest question: how? How can we do that? We need more representation of social sciences, and we need more political sciences and political scientists in this process. And if we are talking about diplomacy, they are the expert of diplomacy. And we can, if we are not reaching on consensus, then we need to reconsider our diplomatic skills. So we need to have more political scientists in this process to update our skills. Why? Because diplomacy can either start or freeze any kind of conflicts on a global scale. 2 years ago, I filmed, for example, I want to give some examples, concrete examples. I filmed sea urchin invasion. I'm also a polar diver. Sea urchin invasion in northern Norway. And it was at an alarming rate. And we shared our results with Norwegian institutions. And underwater footage was really alarming. And also, I'm an emergency manager. And I also shared my data with our community as well, because it's happening. Either you see or you perceive or you don't want to reconsider. So in terms of emergency management, I want to bring this issue to your attention. Right now, especially for the last decade, we have 250 million climate refugees worldwide. And by 2050, we are going to have 1.2 billion climate refugees due to extreme weather-related events. So you will choose either floods or droughts or other extremities, and we are going to have them. So you need to adjust your policies, because by 2050, you will have them. And diplomacy will, we will learn either in the hard way or in easy way. So if we can adjust our diplomatic skills based on science diplomacy principles, then we can go through a smoother process. And think about that, by 250, when we are explaining our grandchildren, are we going to say that we had very overreaching issues, geopolitical issues since then, so we were not fast enough to implement those measures? And what would they say? Even greater than the sustainability of the world. You had those geopolitical shifts. So we need to reconsider that. And by the way, another issue is, for example, we have Nile virus in Swiss Alps. We have mosquitoes in Iceland. And we are going to have ice-free Iceland within 100 years. So these are very overreaching issues compared to our geopolitical rivalries or shifts. So we need to back on track with science diplomacy principles. And when we need to back on track, we need to be more inclusive, because we can learn from different cultures, just like indigenous culture, not only for, I'm not just speaking about Turkey. We can learn from how they adapt to that new normal and how they adapt to those extreme environments, because we need those skills in very near future. And we should, of course, we should protect those emperor penguins, because they are going to be the neighbors of our grandchildren, unfortunately. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ebru emphasized the importance of science diplomacy and communications in a very vivid way, like as in the case of sea urchin. But what just resonates in my head is still political will and diplomatic engagement and government support important. no one can disagree with this. So I think we have made very valid points. Could I just give the panelists a little bit of time to ask questions among themselves? And, well, do you? Can we then go straight to the audience? Or? Okay, now I once again realize I feel like I stand against a great wall. Tell the scientists to collect more data to make it even more solid, or to better illustrate the urgency by employing more fantastic communication skills. Well, that's what we can do, but that's not the problem-solving thing. That's not going to solve the problem we face now. So then, what should we be doing? I think that is the main question. So may I ask floor to raise any questions or provide solutions? That will be better. Okay, Tony, please.
I would like the panel just to respond to what I think is an observation that comes out of what the panel just spoke about, and that is the political will to respond through science diplomacy or to the available science that they have. And I agree. I don't think we need to ask the scientists to do more communication. That's not where the obstacle is. The obstacle really is in the willingness of countries, some countries in particular, inside the Antarctic Treaty System, and I will say China and Russia, because it was obvious at the last Antarctic Treaty meeting that was the case, to accept the science and to do something with it. And the arguments that were put forward against being able to list penguins as specially protected species, and also arguments about what is best available science, they are not cultural in this particular case. They are in fact political, entirely political, and used as a way of blocking consensus, not as a way of using consensus to find a solution. So I'll just put that on the table and see whether anybody wants to respond to that.
Does anyone respond to Tony? Or I saw Narelle first. So
I can start, and then everyone else can correct me. I don't think it's necessarily the responsibility of the scientists to do that. Like, if a country makes a decision, regardless of what that decision is, I think it should be highlighted in the report that this country, not one country, it should be this, like, whichever country it is, should be named. And then it is just a matter of, like, we have the same thing in WMO Congress, right? If there's a decision, it's not consensus, but it might as well be. And if certain countries don't agree, we don't do it because it's member-driven. But they're accountable for that to their own countries and to the world. And I don't think that solves the problem, and maybe I think it's about bringing in the social scientists and really in the political scientists and really understanding exactly how you would take this forward. But in a way, it's, this is how it, the history is. It's a larger political context to a lot of these decisions. And I think it's just a matter of making sure that they're recording this and what is happening politically is not ambiguous when we report on it. And maybe in the longer run, this will go some way in domestic politics to make a difference. But I'm not sure this is the case.
This is a very valid point. Can I ask Ebru to...
That's why I mentioned political sciences. They can be very convincing because they know the nexus, they know the details. I want to give you the example, the case of the United Nations. I was in a conference in Geneva, and we were talking about extreme events, and there were political scientists, and they just put those words into different. They know how to choose the words, how to put it in a very effective way. And one of them made a presentation that we are going to be extinct. And everybody was listening, because before that, some of them were sleeping, but everybody started to listening. How? And then he mentioned about those weather-related incidents and cascading disasters. He gave the case of mega fires. Even Hollywood right now have mega fires, so they are very convincing. In near future, it will convince, these cascading disasters will convince almost everyone. And as long as you can interpret that data in a right way to your communities, you can also take support from them. And as long as you have your community support, then you can convince your policymakers as well. Okay? So political sciences knows these tools to convince others and communities. That's why they are very important and in this process. Thank you.
Okay.
Can I add something? Yeah. I think one thing that I think is really important is what I was mentioning, to keep talking about for countries that do want to see progress and do want to see, that the majority of countries that want to see progress on some of these environmental protection policies, to keep talking about their values and to keep reinforcing them through the statements they make that are in the report and through the proposals they put forward. And the reason is because I have been attending the ATCM and CAMLR since about 2010. And what I see is that a minority of countries are asking for an increasingly high burden of proof for environmental protection measures to be agreed by consensus by them. But of course, then they still don't agree. But they ask for more data and then they get it. And they still don't agree. But and I think it's really important to remember that the protocol and to a large extent the CAMLR Convention are not about being certain. There's a precautionary principle embedded in there, and we don't need perfect certainty to act. And that is something that I would like to see all the countries in the system agree on, and they currently don't. So I think it's important for countries that do value the precautionary approach, they do value an ambitious approach to fulfilling their treaty obligations to protect Antarctica, to make sure that that is reflected both in what they say and what they do. And what I mean by what they do is to not perhaps accept some compromises, even at the expense of not getting action on a particular issue, to not accept compromises that would reinforce perhaps an interpretation of the protocol that is not helpful. For example, like I mentioned earlier, in violet areas, if parties stop looking to create inviolate areas because there is some debate over them right now, I think that would not send the right signal. So I would just, in terms of communicating values, I would just encourage parties to, and in large sense, I'm not necessarily criticizing what anyone's doing now. I think a lot of parties are doing exactly what I just said. So I would just encourage them to keep doing it, even though it might feel a little tough at times, because you keep trying very hard and not getting a result. But I think reinforcing those values and staying, being very public about them is good for the long term. I thought that Japan did an excellent job this year in really highlighting the values that we all should share as part of the Antarctic Treaty System. And I would really like to see other ATCM hosts continue that very public messaging about what the ATCM is about and what it is supposed to be doing.
Phil.
There we go, sorry. Thank you, and yes, I think I'd very much like to reinforce what Claire was saying. In prosecuting our diplomacy on specific issues, we have to be very careful that we don't walk backwards on any general settings or fundamental values, and that's quite a difficult path to walk down at times. And I think it was Patrick who used the term realpolitik. This is where it gets real. I think it's important to remember that political will is up to individual parties. The ATCM represents eventually the collective political will, but for some of the issues we're talking about over the last day or so, almost all parties have the political will to take action. So the task is quite clear. I think for some issues when we're very close to consensus, it's very clear we have to dig in and do our diplomatic work to try and find a way forward, and that can involve an awful lot of work away from the ATCM. Parties will be working bilaterally or in groups to try and advance the discussion and get the other parties into a position where they can agree. And so just be assured that hard work goes on all the time, and usually on many issues it bears fruit at some point, but it's a hard road and sometimes it takes a long time. There are some other issues like tourism where we're not talking about consensus yet because there's a wide range of views. It's a different kind of hard work for those discussions. We have to start to find the common ground and the points that we're going to be eventually seeking to take forward by consensus. And part of that whole diplomatic effort is ensuring that we don't back people into a corner or other parties into a corner, ensuring that we make the space for the conversation to continue. And so that's in some cases why we see reports that don't name countries. We don't want to, not necessarily we, but parties are careful not to push someone into a position where they lose decision options. And so, the diplomatic work, some of it's very visible through the reports and through the meeting itself, and some of it is happening in the background. But there's a few issues where we very clearly have a pathway forward, and those are the ones where we're very close to consensus, and that's where the hard work gets applied. So, thank you.
I think this is all valid. Warning against us making a compromise on fundamental values. This is something we should never take the path on this direction. Also, exhausting diplomatic options is not a wise way too. But I still buy the concept of the current practice of reporting should change. It's just not a matter of naming certain members of countries, but as I see it, okay, maybe the best available science in the earlier years, for example, may in fact have been smaller number of pieces, but this best available science is building up. Then the response we hear remains the same, like we are not in a position to accept the science, and the reason is insufficient. So this is not good. But if the current practice of reporting does remain, they can get away by just simply stating that it's insufficient, blah, blah. Risking, it would look funny, the chair asking questions, not answering, but blaming on lack of political will also not solve the problem, because these members are unlikely to change. So can we create a setting that there is no advantage for those parties to insist their old stance, so that they are also have reason to come to work toward a agreement? I don't have answer, but I'm saying this because applying more pressure is something we should try, but I think there is also a danger of resorting to top-down too much. If this is the only way out, if this is the only way using to reach an agreement, then what we will do next time. So maybe in that context, I may ask the floor. Okay, Sanjay, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. One observation and then a question. Observation relates to the declining number of experts, not declining, but lesser number of experts attending the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings, which means that the rest of the world does not seem to be reaching out to Antarctica, whereas we are trying to reach out to the rest of the world. The second, in the light of the references is made to political will and science, I think there is also a need to acknowledge the Antarctic science dilemma, because science itself, the scientific community at large in the other parts of the world is also facing the dilemma, because this is where you have an interplay between national interests, national programs, and your internationalism and your international commitments. The question that I have, which continues to sort of intrigue me, is that we know there's no disaster management body, although that idea has just come out by some scholars in the southern waters. Tourism is still not close to a consensus. Disasters have happened in the past as well. Now, IHO, Hydrographic Organization, has been sort of constantly reminding the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings that we do not have enough data. We don't have enough information about the nautical charts, for example, in the Southern Ocean. So I wonder, what are the reasons? Is it that we don't have the data? Or if we have the data, then is there a lack of political will to share that data, knowing fully well the implications of this lack or lacuna? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Yes, it's a difficult thing. It's a difficult issue, and I don't think there is a 1-minute cure for this. This may sound funny. I feel like we may be a little too much hung up with the emperor penguin, but we also should be worried about what comes next. What will let's say, we may somehow miraculously strike a deal with emperor penguin, but that's not going to be the end of our journey. More challenges, more tasks will be upcoming, and we should be prepared for that, and we should try to think of more fundamental response to tackle those kind of challenges. Still, I would maybe conclude by saying Antarctic exceptionalism should not be exceptional. It should be a norm. And science will continue to have an important role to play. I'm trying to finish up because what I will never do is to eat into lunchtime. I know that this lunchtime is for only Korean people, so here I pause and thank you for the wonderful contribution of the panelists. Thank you.